Okay, Tony. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us again for this presentation which you did in Canterbury. And the floor is yours. I think we've got about an hour before we'll go to Q&A.
Okay, well, what do I need to press share?
Yes, please. Yeah.
And then it should, right, let's get this. Can you all see that?
Not yet.
So, can you see it?
It's coming through, but you've got it. Yep, there you go. And if you go to the slideshow format, it's about five in
Yeah.
the left-hand side.
Okay, can you see, is that clear?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, let's get started. President Kennedy's head wounds. The autopsy of President Kennedy is hard to get to grips with. For most researchers, it appears to be a confusing mess. We find that things went badly wrong right from the start. A forensic pathologist called Dr. Earl Rose should have done the autopsy. He was the medical examiner for Dallas County at that time, and he was very experienced in firearm homicides. If he had performed the autopsy, he could have reviewed Kennedy's admission notes, he could have spoken directly to hospital staff who treated Kennedy, he could have examined Kennedy's clothes. Also, he could have allowed doctors who treated Kennedy to be present at the autopsy so they could freely exchange information with him during the procedure. A first-class autopsy would have resulted. Unfortunately, that did not happen. The Secret Service forcefully removed President Kennedy's body despite protests from Dr. Rose that this was a violation of Texas state law and that the autopsy should have been done there at Parkland Hospital. The body was flown on Air Force One to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland, where the autopsy was carried out by these three men. Dr. Humes was in charge, and he was assisted by Dr. Boswell. They were both Navy commanders at Bethesda and qualified anatomical pathologists. However, they were not qualified as forensic pathologists. This required extra training for pathologists and would have made them experts in firearm-related deaths, which would have been ideal in a case like this. Also, they were administrators at the time, and they had not done any hands-on autopsy work for years. They called in Dr. Pierre Fink to assist them on the far right there. He worked for the Army, and he was trained as a forensic pathologist. However, he was also an administrator at this time, and he had not done any autopsies for 4 years. Unfortunately, he arrived late at the autopsy when the procedure was well underway and the internal organs had already been removed. The HSCA forensic panel did a thorough review of the autopsy of President Kennedy and said that the autopsy had extensive failings and that multiple procedural errors were made. They felt that the autopsy was flawed and incomplete. Personally, reviewing the autopsy and the associated forensics, the question that comes to my mind is, why do we find so many contradictions? Well, what sort of contradictions do I mean? Here are some of the contradictions relating to head wounds. Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell described to the ARRB scalp wounds, which contradicted descriptions they made in the autopsy report. The autopsy report and Dr. Boswell contradict each other regarding the description of skull wounds. Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell contradicted each other in their description of the entry wound at the back of the head when they testified to the ARRB. The autopsy report and the HSCA forensic panel contradicted each other regarding the position of the entry wound at the back of the head. Autopsy photographs appear to contradict observations made by medical staff at Parkland Hospital. Autopsy photographs contradict descriptions found in the autopsy report. The Zapruder film shows skull fragments being expelled from the top of the head, but nobody at Parkland Hospital reported seeing an exit wound in this area. Autopsy x-rays show a line of bullet fragments that occupies a different position to that described in the autopsy report. The problem with these contradictions is that they should not exist. Autopsy x-rays should never contradict the autopsy report, and autopsy photographs should never contradict the autopsy report. In this presentation, I will try and resolve all these contradictions and find out which versions of the autopsy findings are the correct ones, and find out what this tells us about how President Kennedy died. To do this, I will split my talk into 6 parts as follows. In part 1, we will ask the question, what exactly was the scalp damage? In part 2, what exactly was the skull damage? In part 3, where was the rear entry wound? In part 4, what was the nature of the rear entry wound? In part 5, what caused the trail of metal fragments seen on the x-rays? In part 6, we will do a summary and try to sort out the contradictions and then make some conclusions. So let's get started. Part 1, what exactly was the scalp damage? Here are some pictorial representations of scalp damage. On the left, you can see the damage as recorded in the autopsy report. The blue area represents an area of complete loss of scalp and skull on the right side of the head. Looking at the pictures on the right side, we can see the scalp damage according to Dr. Boswell. When Dr. Boswell appeared before the ARRB, he was given a skull and asked to draw on the skull where damage to the scalp and underlying bone had occurred. Damage to skull bone has been left off my pictures for clarity, and what you see represents the scalp damage that Dr. Boswell drew on the skull. The difference between the 2 versions is marked. You may even wonder, were Humes and Boswell at the same autopsy? If we read Dr. Boswell's testimony to the ARRB, we find out that Dr. Boswell did describe an area of scalp loss, but he did not draw it on the skull. This is surprising because it is the most striking feature of the scalp damage when you look at the autopsy version. It is also surprising that Dr. Boswell told the ARRB that there was very little scalp loss. It is even more surprising that Dr. Humes also told the ARRB that not much scalp was missing. So here we have the contradiction. The autopsy report referred to a huge area of scalp loss, but Humes and Boswell both told the ARRB that there was very little scalp loss. So which version is more plausible? Is the autopsy version more plausible? The report states, in this region, there is an actual absence of scalp and bone, producing a defect which measures approximately 13 centimeters in greatest diameter. Some practical experiments seem to support this version. TV documentary Inside the Target Car used some highly accurate synthetic heads, which they accurately positioned in a model of the limousine, and a Mannlicher Carcano rifle was used to fire bullets at each head using the correct distances and angles for a number of different firing positions in Dealey Plaza. When the rifle was fired to represent a shot from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, a high entry point was used on the head, consistent with the entry wound that the HSCA forensic panel thought was correct. The result was that a large area of scalp and bone was blasted out from the right side of the head. This is the area shown in black on the pictures you can see. Looking at these illustrations, the autopsy version does appear to correspond well with the Inside the Target Car version. However, the autopsy version does not match the autopsy photographs. The back of the head should show a very large hole higher on the right, where scalp and bone have been blown out. But this area here that I'm showing, there should be this huge hole here in this area, but there is only intact scalp here. Also, there's a Zapruder version. So the autopsy version does not match the Zapruder film either. The pictures on the left show that, according to the autopsy report, there was a large area of absent skull and scalp above the right ear and extending backwards from this area. However, the Zapruder films we can see on the right show intact scalp and plenty of hair on it in the same area. So here, there should be a great big hole, and here there should be a hole, but there's scalp with hair on it. There are serious problems with the autopsy version. The large exit wound was created in the synthetic model head, only using a high entry wound at the back of the head. However, the autopsy report stated that there was a low entry site on the back of the head, and I will show you later that this was the correct version. A large hole on the right side of the head, created by a single bullet entering high on the back of the head, would be associated with a spray of blood known as the back spatter. This should easily be seen on the Zapruder film, but no such spray of blood can be seen coming out the back of the head. The huge cavity on the right side of the head described in the autopsy report was not reported by any other observers. Most witnesses at Parkland Hospital and witnesses at Bethesda Hospital, apart from the pathologists, reported seeing a hole only at the back of the head on the right side. Mortuary technician Tom Robinson said he only had to deal with a small area of scalp loss. The bottom line is to say that, according to the autopsy report, there was a large cavity in the right side of the head where scalp, bone, and brain had been blasted out. The hole was so large that most people could have put their fist into it, and yet the medical staff at Parkland Hospital did not report seeing this large cavity. Is the small exit wound version more plausible? Dr. Humes and Boswell both told the ARRB that there was little scalp loss. This suggests a smaller exit wound. Is this more plausible than the autopsy version? To answer this question, we need to find out if Humes and Boswell really said there was little scalp loss, and where exactly was this scalp loss? First of all, let's see what Dr. Boswell told the ARRB. On page 92, he is asked the question, what portions of scalp were missing when you started the autopsy? Dr. Boswell, actually very little. Then a little later, he is asked the question, so that it would be fair to say that although there was a very large piece of skull missing, there was very little scalp missing. And Dr. Boswell says, right. Now let's see what Dr. Humes told the ARRB. On page 89, he is talking about skull damage on the right side of the head when he says, not as much scalp. There was some scalp missing, but we were able to pretty much close the scalp skin when we finished everything. So I can't tell you how much was, but it was not that much skin missing, no. And then on page 90, he is asked, when the embalming process was completed, approximately how much scalp was missing? Dr. Humes, oh, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 centimeters, something like that. Not much. We were able to, you can undermine the skin, you know, and we pretty much closed it. On page 91, Dr. Humes is asked, approximately where was the missing scalp as of the time that the embalming process was completed? And Dr. Humes replies, you got me. A strange reply. He has just told them that there were 3 or 4 centimeters of scalp missing, and then when they ask him where it was, His immediate response is to say, "You got me." Well, let's go on. Dr. Hume says, "You got me. I don't think there was, I mean, we were able to close it by undermining and stretching and so forth. I don't recall that we did not completely close the skin and the scalp." He is then asked, without stretching the scalp, basically how much scalp was missing at the time the body arrived at Bethesda. Dr. Humes, I couldn't, it would be a rough guess, maybe 3 or 4 centimeters, something like that. So what happened to the defect of scalp and bone 13 centimeters across that he described in the autopsy report? Here he is completely contradicting himself. On page 92, Dr. Humes is asked, "Do you have any knowledge as to where the missing skull or missing scalp was?" Dr. Humes, "No, it wasn't that much. I am telling you, it was more torn than missing." We could see that Dr. Boswell told the ARRB that there was very little scalp loss, but never said where this was. And Dr. Humes said there was not much scalp missing, but as soon as he is asked where the missing scalp was, he avoids answering the question and tries to suggest that the scalp was more torn than missing. Both pathologists reject the autopsy version where there is an area of completely absent scalp, about 13 centimeters by about 6 centimeters, and tell the ARRB that very little scalp was missing. What we need is somebody who handled the head of President Kennedy on the night of the autopsy to tell us where the missing scalp was. And that man is mortician Tom Robinson. He repaired the head of President Kennedy after the autopsy was completed. He testified to the ARRB that there was an area of absent scalp 3 inches across he had to deal with. He placed a circular rubber sheet behind this hole and stitched the scalp onto this rubber. Tom Robinson stated the area of missing scalp was at the back of the head. He thought it was in the middle of the back of the head. However, he also stated that when the head was on a pillow and turned slightly to the right, the wound was not visible. This suggests the hole was more to the right side than he remembered. Is a small exit wound through the scalp at the back of the head more plausible? Well, yes, of course it is. It is consistent with what many of the staff at Parkland Hospital saw. It is consistent with what many of the support staff at Bethesda Naval Hospital saw. Researcher, author, and photography expert Robert Groden spent decades finding people who saw Kennedy's head after he had been shot. He found over 80 people who say they saw an exit wound at the back of the head on the right side. Was the scalp exit wound? What was the scalp exit wound like? In summary, we can now say the huge area of scalp loss described in the autopsy report was not plausible. Dr. Humes and Boswell revealed to the ARRB that the area of scalp loss was much smaller than the area they described in the autopsy report. Drs. Humes and Boswell avoided saying where the scalp loss was, but Tom Robinson testified to the ARRB that the scalp loss was at the back of the head. Okay, moving on to the next point. Where did the frontal laceration end? Dr. Boswell showed a laceration over the frontal bone on the right side that extended as far as the right upper eyelid. You can see this is the version that he promoted. But there was no confirmation for this provided by photographs or witness statements. Dr. Humes described this wound as ending on the forehead about 4 centimeters above the right supraorbital ridge, which means the right eyebrow, basically. So he said it ended here. On balance, this seems the more likely version, so we will go with that. Was the end of the frontal laceration a point of bullet entry? Lacerations can originate from bullet entrance wounds or exit wounds. There is evidence for a headshot entering the forehead on the right side as follows. Dr. David Mantic and Dr. Michael Chesser have seen the X-rays in the archives and noted a small cloud of tiny bullet fragments in the forehead area visible on the lateral X-rays. This is evidence of a bullet entry near this area. Forensic pathologist Sherry Feaster noted that there is back spatter in the area of the right forehead, clearly visible on the Zapruder film. Again, consistent with a bullet entering this area. Long-term researcher and author Josiah Thompson has noted the people outside the limousine who were struck by blood and bone fragments were only found behind and to the left of the vehicle, which is consistent with a bullet coming through the head having entered from the right side of the forehead. Could such a long laceration be caused by a bullet entry? Well, the answer is yes, because TV documentary Inside the Target Car accurately replicated a shot to the right forehead area, and it immediately produced a long laceration going backwards from the entry wound. It produced a couple of other lacerations that we'll look at later. Were there any witnesses who saw a right frontal entry wound? Well, yes, there were. Dr. Charles Crenshaw reported seeing an entry wound in the right side of the forehead, just below the hairline. Mortician Tom Robinson testified that he filled in a small hole in the same location. There are 3 witnesses who reported seeing a right frontal entry wound on the autopsy photographs. Joe O'Donnell worked with White House photographer Robert Knutson, and he claimed that Knutson had shown him an autopsy photograph that showed a right frontal entry wound. Quentin Schwinn, a photography student, reported being shown the same type of photograph at Rochester Institute of Technology during a job interview. Doug Horn spent 3 years investigating him for the ARRB and came to the conclusion that he was a trustworthy witness. Dennis David, a petty officer at Bethesda, stated he was shown a photograph which showed a right frontal entry wound by William Pitzer, who was the head of the audiovisual department at Bethesda Hospital. To summarize this section on the frontal laceration, we can say that the available evidence suggests that a long laceration was caused by a bullet entering the right side of the forehead, just below the hairline. Now, here's an interesting question. How did skull bone exit through intact scalp? This autopsy photograph of the left side of the head of President Kennedy shows completely intact scalp. This is consistent with statements from witnesses at Parkland Hospital and Bethesda Hospital. These pictures were drawn by Dr. Boswell and show loss of skull bone on the left side of the head. The picture on the left was drawn on the night of the autopsy, and it shows an area of bone loss 10 centimeters by 17 centimeters at the top of the head. The picture on the right side is a copy of what Dr. Boswell drew on a skull for the ARRB in the 1990s. It shows loss of skull bone on the right side of the head, but extending well over onto the left side of the head. Dr. Boswell testified to the ARRB and said that 30 to 40% of the bone loss was on the left side of the head. The problem is, how did all this bone exit upwards, but leave the scalp on top completely undamaged? We can look at some possible explanations. Firstly, the bone loss reported was not accurate. I will show you later that the X-rays do tend to support what Dr. Boswell said. Secondly, there were large holes in the scalp not previously reported. I could find no evidence to support this idea. And thirdly, the scalp split in places, forming flaps. These flaps sprang out of the way of exiting bone and then sprang back again. We need to consider this idea further. Could a frontal headshot cause scalp flaps? The TV documentary Inside the Target Car replicated a frontal headshot. Lacerations appeared on the synthetic head that looked like this on still photographs taken after the shot. At one point during the documentary, the effects of a frontal headshot fired from the grassy knoll was shown in slow motion. Scalp flaps were formed and sprang open in a fraction of a second. You can see these are the flaps appearing for an infinitesimally small period of time. These flaps can be seen in slow motion. Brain matter was expelled, and then the flaps sprang back, and the edges were so tightly back together that they were almost invisible. Okay, is there any evidence to support the two triangular flaps theory? You will remember that Dr. Boswell described a single long slit through the scalp going from front to back on the right side. He told the ARRB on page 58, you could fold the scalp over and almost hide the wound. When you lifted the scalp up, you could really lay it back posteriorly. This is inconsistent with his description of the scalp damage. On page 60, he remembers his original version of scalp damage and says, and what I meant was that the wound in the scalp could be closed from side to side, so that it didn't appear there was any scalp missing. But by page 70 of his testimony, he has forgotten his version of scalp damage when he is asked if the scalp was removed to look inside. Well, we actually folded it back below. On page 97, he says, the scalp was pulled forward in order to demonstrate the wound of entrance, and then the scalp was reflected to show the magnitude of the wound, and then to remove the brain through one long slit. Well, there's a novelty. On page 97, he says, the scalp was essentially loose. The scalp was mobile, so you could pull it forward or pull it back. Well, scalp that has become loose from the underlying skull bone fits in with the scalp flaps theory. The scalp flaps theory, what can it explain? Well, as we've seen, it can explain how a bone appears to have gone through intact scalp, but it can also explain what the autopsy photographs show, what the Zapruder film shows, what the staff at Parkland Hospital saw, and what the staff at Bethesda Naval Hospital saw. We can look at these in turn. Now, the autopsy photographs. With the flaps down, the hair soaked with blood, Kennedy's head could have looked like this, the top picture. With one flap pulled back, it would look like the lower picture on the left. You can see a triangular flap pulled backwards. With two flaps pulled back, it would look like the lower picture on the right. The picture on the left shows the two flaps folded backward. And the picture on the right shows what would happen if some of the inner layers of scalp have separated from the outer layer of scalp, which is firmer and it holds all the hair in it. The softer inner layers have slipped off the outer layer and can be seen in this brown area. So this area of brown matter, that's inner layers of scalp that are slipping off the outer scalp, which still retains its triangular shape. Now, if we put this picture on the right next to the actual autopsy picture, now you can see here where these flaps come to a point if you imagine the point of the flaps are folded back out of sight of the camera, then you might see something like this, where the points are being folded out of sight. And in this photograph, you will notice on this real autopsy photograph, this triangular area here of emitting scalp tissue. The triangular flaps folded backwards, it gives a perfect explanation for this defect. Some researchers claim a bullet going through the head from back to front caused this defect. However, you can see there is intact skull in the base of that triangle. It looks pretty solid there. Only scalp has been removed from this area. So how could a bullet coming through from behind cause a perfect triangular defect in scalp to be created like that? Some researchers say that surgery was done on the head at some point after Kennedy left Parkland Hospital to disguise shots hitting the head from in front. I cannot see why somebody doing this would cut out very obvious area of scalp in a very obvious large triangular area like that, where everyone could see it. I think this theory of scalp flaps being folded backwards is more plausible. And what did Dr. Humes say about this picture? Dr. Humes was asked, near the top of the president's head, there is matter that is extruding. What is that matter? Dr. Humes, that scalp reflected that way. Question, does that consist of any brain matter or is it entirely scalp as best as you can tell? Dr. Humes, I think it's just scalp. So Dr. Humes is saying this whole area here is scalp folded backwards. Okay, now the Zapruder film, in the Zapruder film, that the head looks strange, and we see no obvious hole in the scalp. The scalp appears to dip inwards in places where bone is missing, but the scalp looks continuous over the head. In addition, there is an odd blob of soft tissue on the side of the head that appears to be sitting on top of the scalp. Can we explain these appearances? We can explain them the way things look as follows. Scalp flaps spring open in a fraction of a second and skull bone explodes out through the opening. A large clump of pulverized brain is also expelled. Here's the clump of brain. It's also expelled, but it's still attached to the inside of the cranium by strands of membrane that normally cover the brain. These scalp flaps then snap back to their original position, but the membrane gets trapped between adjacent flap edges here. The Zapruder film would then show the following. The middle picture shows where on the head brain matter would hang down like a saddlebag below a line where the membrane is trapped between two flap edges. This brain matter will move about with motions of the limousine. The pictures on either side show the brain matter and intact scalp above it that dips into the depression in the head where bone is missing. At Parkland Hospital, with the flaps closed, the scalp would look intact from the front. Kennedy's blood-soaked hair would have covered the flap edges, so they would not have been visible. The entry wound on the right side of the forehead at the hairline would be covered with hair most of the time and difficult to see unless viewed from a low angle or if the hair was pushed back. A hole in the back of the head on the right side would be visible throughout the whole time. At Bethesda Hospital, with the flaps down, the scalp would look intact. With the flaps folded back, a huge hole in the skull would be exposed, and a hole in the back of the head would be visible throughout the autopsy. So how did skull bone exit through intact scalp? In summary, we can say that scalp flaps rapidly opening and closing can explain this. Scalp flaps can also explain what the autopsy photographs show, what the Zapruder film shows, what the doctors at Parkland Hospital saw, what the staff at Bethesda Hospital saw, and certain comments made by Dr. Boswell about folding back scalp. Okay, moving on to a new question. Is there evidence for another entry wound in the scalp? Yes, there are witnesses who reported seeing an entrance wound in the right temple area. In the limousine, there was Texas State Trooper Herschel Jacks. At Parkland Hospital, there was Dr. Gene Atkin and Dr. Robert Walker. At Bethesda Hospital, James Jenkins reported seeing a hole with a greyish rim. And Dr. Carney also reported a temporal wound. These observations can be matched to a skull wound, as we shall see later. So that the scalp damage was probably similar to this, with 3 entry wounds, 1, 2, 3, and only 1 overtly visible exit wound here. But we'll look at this more as we go on. Okay, part 2. Exactly what was the skull damage? Here we can see the skull damage according to Dr. Humes, as written in the autopsy report, and the damage according to Boswell, as shown on the skull he was asked to draw on by the ARRB. The 2 versions are contradictory. You will notice that Dr. Boswell described a much larger area of bone loss. Where Humes and Boswell are in agreement regarding bone loss is in the upper part of the back of the head on the right. So both of them describe loss of bone here and here. Obviously, that's a much larger area. And the X-rays support this finding. So if you look at this front to back X-ray here, this area here is dark, meaning there's a lot of bone loss in that area. Does this autopsy photograph confirm an area of bone loss at the back of the head? The HSCA said that this was a photograph of the front of the head. However, a 1968 catalogue of autopsy photographs stated that this was the back of the head. This catalogue was compiled by Dr. Humes, Dr. Boswell, radiologist Paul Eversole, and photographer John Stringer, 4 people who saw President Kennedy's head at the autopsy. Autopsy technician Paul O'Connor, at a later date, also said that he saw this photograph and it was of the back of the head. Studies of this photograph have confirmed that it does indeed show the back of the head. Dr. David Mantic saw this photograph and similar photographs in the National Archives and noted that they looked clearer and were less cropped than the bootleg versions on the internet today. He could see abdominal fat pads above the wound. Using a stereoscopic viewer, he could see the chest and a nipple above the wound. Dr. Michael Chesser also saw these photographs in the archives. He saw the V-shaped defect above the wound that we were talking about, and he also saw some chest above the defect. It would be impossible to see the abdomen and chest above the wound if it was a head wound just above the forehead. Therefore, this photograph must be of the back of the head. So the area of bone loss described by the pathologist is confirmed by this photograph. The area of absent skull is consistent with the area of absent scalp that we discussed earlier. Note the beveled semicircular area that looks like an exit wound from a bullet traveling from front to back. Oh, I can't quite see it, but sorry, this area here. Okay. Where Humes and Boswell were also in agreement was that they both referred to loss of bone on the right side of the head. However, neither of their versions correspond well with the autopsy x-rays. The x-rays show bone loss generally high up and towards the front here, while as they both of them show a lot of bone loss lower down towards the back. So neither of their versions fitted well with the x-rays. The main contradiction between the two versions is the fact that Dr. Humes suggested that bone loss was confined to the right side of the head, but Dr. Boswell described loss of bone extending over the top of the head and across to the skull on the left side of the head. X-rays support Dr. Boswell's version, as we can see in the next slide. In the X-ray at the top, you can see the dark area extending over the top of the head. So this dark area here is where skull bone has been blown out, but it extends past the midline and across to the left side. On the right side of the X-ray at the top of the skull, along here, you see a thick layer of white matter. This is an expanse of bone seen almost edge on. If you look carefully, you will see there is a dark area extending into the white zone here. Here's a close-up view, and you can see this dark area extending into the white zone. This is probably a disc-shaped area of missing bone at the top of the skull, going into the area of bone on the right side of the X-ray, which will be the left side of Kennedy's head. The lower three pictures represent views of the head from the right side. The far right picture is an X-ray taken years before the assassination. You will notice the area high up towards the front is very white. So it's this area here is very white, which means plenty of bone is present. But in the middle picture, an autopsy X-ray, you will see the whole area is much darker. And I believe this is due to loss of bone high up on both the right side and the left side, producing this very dark area. Why would there be an area of bone loss on the left side on the top of the skull? To understand this, we need to look into the forensics of blood spatter. Question: if a bullet goes right through a man's head, in how many directions can blood, bone, and brain exit the skull? The correct answer is 3 directions, because there is forward spatter, there is burst injury, and there is back spatter. Is there any evidence for back spatter? The late Sherry Feaster, a forensic pathologist from Texas, said, the prominent blood spatter pattern on the Zapruder film, frame 313, corresponds in every measurable manner with back spatter. The blood observed in the Zapruder film displays the pattern shape of back spatter. It also extends from the wound area a distance that is characteristic of back spatter. The timing for pattern creation and the dissipation rate identifies it as back spatter. In fact, all the available information concerning the blood spatter pattern in the Zapruder film corresponds in every measurable manner with back spatter replicated in forensic laboratories and described in peer-reviewed publications since the late 1980s. This was her field of expertise, and she was certain that back spatter could be seen arising from the front of Kennedy's head on the right side. Where exactly was the back spatter coming from? Well, we've already seen the witnesses Charles Crenshaw, Tom Robinson, Joe O'Donnell, Quentin Schwinn, and Dennis David saw a small right frontal entry wound. Also, neurologist Michael Chesser has seen the skull x-rays in the archives, and he has found evidence for an entry wound through the frontal bone. So the back spatter was coming from this wound. Is there any evidence of burst injury? A bullet going through the brain will create a temporary cavity as brain tissue is hurled outwards in a radial pattern around the speeding bullet. This then exerts extreme pressure on the skull bones in milliseconds. The pressure will rip out skull bone at the weakest point, which is the bone at the top of the head. Burst injury can be easily seen on the Zapruder film as large fragments of skull are flung out, traveling at over 80 miles per hour. Question, in which direction do the fragments fly? Skull fragments are flung out by the explosive force of the temporary cavitation process. It can be likened to a short cannon. The strong base and side walls resist the huge pressure of exploding gunpowder, and the pressure is directed onto the cannonball. The cannonball is propelled out in the direction the cannon is pointing, as you would expect. But what about a bullet going through the head? When you look at the case of a bullet through the head, you find that the strong bones of the skull base and lower parts of the side walls resist the pressure generated by the temporary cavitation process. The high pressure is channeled upwards, causing fragmentation of bone across the top of the head, and also very rapid expulsion of these fragments upwards in the direction the top of the head is pointing. Is there any evidence for this idea? Well, if you look at frame 313 of the Zapruder film, you will see two fragments of bone being expelled. The white arrows show their direction of movement. The dark red arrow is drawn at 30 degrees to the vertical, as this is the angle of tilt of President Kennedy's head at this moment. You can see that the arrows are quite close. Any more compelling evidence? Well, there was a TV documentary Inside the Target Car. The documentary studied the Zapruder film and film of their reconstruction at the time of a headshot from behind. The movement of fragments was plotted and entered into a computer system in each case. In each case, a vector was created to represent the average movement of all the expelled skull fragments, and they produced a picture similar to this. They then noted that the two vector arrows were at the same angle, 30 degrees to the vertical. They then concluded that the Zapruder film must be showing a shot from above and behind, as it was for their reconstruction. However, they did not mention that the forward tilt of the head was also 30 degrees to the vertical in both cases. This shows that the fragments were being expelled in the direction the head was pointing, and nothing more than this. The explosive head wound of frame 313 of the Zapruder film is associated with burst injury and not forward spatter. In forward spatter, momentum from the bullet is transferred to bone, brain, and blood, which are expelled in the direction the bullet is traveling through the head. The burst injury blood spatter goes in the direction the top of the head is pointing. All that we can tell from the Zapruder film is that a bullet with high kinetic energy passed under the right side of the skull, and blood, brain, and bone were blown out vertically from the top of the head. If you think the green area is forward spatter, which it is not, then you erroneously conclude that the bullet hit the head from behind. Okay, well, where was the real forward spatter? In this, is this visible on the Zapruder film? No. Is this surprising? Well, no. Why? Because forward spatter is much faster than back spatter. Some research has shown that forward spatter can be 3.5 times faster than the bullet hitting the skull. Was back spatter revealed because it struck people around the limousine? Yes. Author Josiah Thompson looked into this. In his talk, A Granular Account of the Final Second of the Assassination, Josiah Thompson used the following picture. He shows that forward spatter struck people behind and to the left of the limousine. He noted that blood spatter only went onto the left side of the body of police motorcyclist B.J. Martin, and showed that this was due to the positioning of police motorcyclist Bobby Hargis, who created a rain shadow with his body at this moment in time. We can highlight the wedge where forward spatter occurred by colouring it yellow. We can now focus on President Kennedy's head at this time. Computer studies have shown that his head was turned 25.6 degrees to the left at this time. In the picture on the right side, we can see the yellow wedge coming to a point at the back of the head where we know there was an exit wound. So here's that yellow wedge coming to the back of the head. But here we see a problem for a shot hitting the right forehead fired from the fence on the grassy knoll. The bullet would have to deflect 65 degrees on entry to the skull and then deflect between 32 degrees and 64 degrees at the point of exit from the skull. This seems unlikely. They're really quite large deflections. However, if we consider an exit point towards the front of the head, the bullet deflections would be less, and this shot would seem more plausible. Let us continue to consider a shot from the area at the top of the grassy knoll and consider how things would look from the front. A shot from the grassy knoll area would come down at an angle of 5 degrees to the horizontal. However, it is known that Kennedy's head was tilted to the left by 18.1 degrees. This means the bullet would be coming down from the wooden fence, but would have a slight upward trajectory relative to Kennedy's head. The bullet would go through the brain and hit a midline anatomical structure. So the bullet would come in and it would hit this structure in the midline. What is the name of that structure? Well, the bullet would hit a tough membrane between the right and left hemispheres of the brain, known as the falx cerebri. Falx means sickle. It's shaped like a sickle. The upper part of the falx is attached to the skull bone immediately above. The thing to note about this membrane is that it is so tough that some articles on forensic ballistics report that bullets can ricochet off this structure. So this is what I think happened. A partially jacketed, pointed hunting round was fired from the fence at the top of the grassy knoll. The bullet punched a hole through the frontal bone on the right side. Inside the skull, the tip of the bullet starts to flatten or mushroom, as it is sometimes described. The bullet is no longer streamlined and rapidly decelerates. The kinetic energy drops dramatically as a result. So what happens to the energy? The answer is it becomes the energy to drive the upward explosion of brain and bone out the top of the head. This is through the temporary cavitation process, which produces maximum force for this type of bullet when the bullet has penetrated less than 1 centimeter of brain. The huge force rips bone off the top of the skull before the bullet even reaches the falx. The tip of the bullet has already mushroomed and the lead core started to break apart at the time the bullet hits the falx. The bullet will probably be tumbling and hit the falx either side on or tail first. The falx has lost the structural support above as this has been blown out, so the falx is loose as described in the autopsy report. The falx is forcefully pushed against the left cerebral hemisphere, which has the consistency of soft modeling clay. And the disintegrating bullet, I believe, would ricochet off the falx, off this membrane, and that the bullet pushes out a circular area of skull bone above and slightly to the left of the midline. At this point, we should note that Kennedy's head would be subject to a force that would drive it backwards and to the left. And this is what we see on the Zapruder film. Now, Dr. David Mantic and Dr. Michael Chesser both saw skull x-rays in the archives. They saw a small area towards the front of the head where dozens of tiny metallic fragments were present. These cannot be seen clearly on copies of the bootleg versions on the internet. So what I've done is I've colored the area blue, as you can see here. I did wonder if these fragments were actually deposited on the falx cerebri. Looking at the diagrams and considering the angles, we can see that a bullet would have to deflect 25 degrees on entering the skull for this to work. It would have to hit the falx here, and so it would have to deflect 25 degrees. The bullet could then exit the skull where the circle is shown here. 25 degrees is not a large deflection, so this does appear to be possible. Okay, so a summary on this point. We can summarize this section by asking why is there loss of bone on the left side of the skull, to which we can now answer the loss of bone on the left side is due to a frontal headshot exiting this area. The evidence for this shot is the witnesses, Charles Crenshaw, Tom Robinson, Joe O'Donnell, Quentin Schwinn, and Dennis David. X-ray features of a lead snowstorm, left-sided bone loss, and back spatter features, burst injury blood spatter features, and forward spatter features are all consistent with this shot. We can move on to evidence for an entrance wound through the skull in the right temporal area. Dr. McDonald, the HSCA, noted loss of bone in the upper part of the right temporal bone. Neurologist Dr. Michael Chesser studied the lateral x-rays in the archives and found bone damage that appeared to be a keyhole type entrance wound through the temporal bone. And he was convinced that there was an entrance wound through bone at this site. This finding links well with witness statements of a wound in the scalp in the right temporal area. So if we accept a shot through the right temple, the possible second shot is shown here. And this is the shot that could account for the blowout wound at the back of the head on the right. This is the version that's favoured by David Mantic and Mike Chesser and Doug Horn. They all seem to favour this particular shot. And the skull damage was probably something like that. And that is the end of the first session. We'll leave it there.
Okay. Thank you, Tony. Well, again, there's a lot to unpack, and from my recall, you've amended some of the slides. I think from
Yes,
what we saw in Canterbury. I've got a couple of questions, but what I'd like to do first is there's a few people on the call here that weren't at Canterbury. And I know someone like Brooks. Is Brooks still on the call? He's done a lot of work on Bethesda and studied Lifton and the ARRB and so forth. Perhaps if I could just open it up to the people that didn't attend Canterbury to ask some questions first. And maybe Brooks, would you like to comment? Do you have any thoughts on the discussion so far? Okay. Well, Brooks might have disappeared.
Okay.
He's showing attendance, but okay. Is there anybody else who wasn't at Canterbury that would like to open up with a question on this first section? No? Okay.
All stunned into silence.
Yes, exactly. Well, it is, to be fair, if you're not medical, it is quite a complex subject to, to follow. Can I just ask regarding, you made a statement that the shot from the stockade fence,
Yeah.
which is obviously at a height, we've all been, well, a lot of us have been there, and we've been to the position which you've actually documented on your couple of slides, which is, on the parallel to Elm, say 1 to 2 meters from the corner of the fence.
Yes, yes.
So we know that's a higher elevation, Tony, but I think you said that because of the Kennedy tilt, the head tilt, there was a slight upward trajectory. Could you just go back to that side and slide again, or try and explain what you meant by that? Because that sounds counterintuitive to me.
All right, I'll see if I can find it. Basically, it's quite a shallow downward angle that some people have measured to be about 5 degrees. So it's quite a shallow downward angle. But Kennedy's head was tilted to his left side quite a marked degree, at 18 degrees, which will more than compensate for the only 5-degree drop from the fence. So the bullet will still be going downwards, but relative to the head, it will have a slight upward trajectory.
Yeah, now I get that now. Now that's making sense to me. So yeah, and the head's not tilted forward at this point. It's just tilted 18 degrees to the side, is it?
No, it's actually tilted forwards and tilted over.
Oh, okay. All right, because I think you said, what did you say the forward tilt was? 25 degrees or something, did you say?
Yes, something like that.
So this is 18 degrees to the left and 25 degrees forward. And
Yeah.
and despite the 5 degrees elevation, it's still going to come in at an upward trajectory into the head.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
No, are you with me?
Yeah, no, I am now. That's quite helpful. Are there any other questions so far? No. Could you go back to the slide with the 3 headshots where you pinpoint the 3 headshots, please?
Sorry, what was it like?
It was a slide with three dots representing the headshots. One from the rear, the mantic headshot, and the temple headshot.
Yeah, because I don't think we've done the final one where we're showing all the shots.
Well, you did touch on one with three headshots.
I think it was a slide. It seemed to be one of the first slides, my recollection.
Mm-hmm.
No, it wasn't this far in. This wasn't this early, was it? No.
I can't think one showing 3 shots at this point.
I thought you did. I thought you showed a rear head wound, a head wound behind the ear, a small circle behind the ear, and then one by the temple. But
I think I know which one you mean. It is
yeah,
showing the.
I mean, you may have been getting ahead.
Of,
You may have been getting ahead of yourself on the shots, but
I think it was a summary of the scalp damage. I think. Sorry, it might be that. Was it that one? Was it?
no, it was. Was it that one? Oh yes, it was. I do beg your pardon.
Yeah.
I do beg your pardon because you've got the 3 dots there. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was to show a summary of what I think the scalp damage was roughly.
Right.
And it's unusual in that it's got 3 entry wounds, but only 1 apparent big exit wound.
Yeah. So in terms of the scalp, just to summarize that, then in terms of the scalp damage, it's the temple shot that causes the 2 large flap issue.
The temple shot here.
Oh, that one.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm guessing that's. I thought it was the one by
the temple shot blows out the back of the head here.
Yeah. But that
one there actually exits the top and slightly to the left.
Yes. Yeah.
Here.
So that one there you're discussing there, you do not call that the temple shot then? What do you call that? The hairline shot or what?
Yeah, the frontal shot.
You just call that okay, sorry.
Frontal shot because it's through the frontal bone. It's the frontal shot.
Yeah.
And it exits at the top slightly to the left. And I'm saying that these flaps came out at the key moment, and that's why nobody saw a hole in the scalp there.
Okay. So when Kilduff is describing, I mean, he's not a doctor, but it's based on what the doctors have said to him. He's pointing. Is he pointing? Is he pointing to that frontal shot area, or is he? I think that's where he is pointing personally. But you're saying the actual temple shot is the one in front of the ear on the right-hand side.
Yes. Yeah. It's
that one there.
Somewhere down here. Yeah.
Okay, so so it's, maybe the layman gets confused with what is actually the temple area. Okay, it's because I think Kilduff is pointing to the other shot. What do you think?
When you see clips of them, his hand is quite high up.
It is, isn't it? Yeah,
high up. So I think.
So he's pointing to that. He's pointing to what you're now calling the frontal shot, basically. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's where I was slightly confused. Okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions at this stage? Tony, can we just have a few minutes break? I'll pause the recording so people can go to the loo, get a drink. In my case,
good idea.
In my case, I need to feed the dog.
Okay, Neil, just to let you know that Mr. LaPlante is having difficulty with the sound. Okay, so he's going to log out and log back in.
Okay. If he does log back in whilst I'm just feeding Hudson, could you if he wants to ask questions, could you just reach out to him, or he
Yeah.
can put it in the chat and we can ask.
Yeah, that's what I've asked him to do. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to pause the recording. Okay. So just before we move on to the second section, we have got a couple of questions from the floor. So can I go to Brooks first?
Sure. I just want to make a couple comments. Sorry, my camera's not working still, but I did get the audio going, which is good. You know, the kudos to Tony for the work here, and it's a really deep dig as you get into all of the medical evidence and trying to piece it all together. I have spent quite a few hours, weeks upon weeks, months down this rabbit hole. And I would say collectively within the community of researchers over 60 some odd years, I'm absolutely convinced more than 1 million man hours have been devoted to, and it conjures up a great debate, but we're trying to solve and figure out the number of shots that struck Kennedy in the head, the sequence of those shots. We now have from Mantic and Horn and Chesser a 3-shot scenario. Trying to determine the exit damage that was caused by these shots. And again, Mantic, Chesser, and Horn all agree that not every bullet caused an exit wound or noticeable exit wound.
Yeah.
And then the last thing being the origin of the shots. Where were the shooters? Where were the shots fired from? More than 1 million man hours have been spent on these various aspects. And I think it's a great effort. It's a virtual rabbit hole because you go in there and you just disappear. And there's a lot of disparity, I think, among researchers, a lot of disagreement. I think if you take the Zapruder film at face value, and again, we have a divided camp. There are some very credible researchers like Tink Thompson and Robert Groden that don't think the film has been altered. I think the sizable majority of researchers believe it has been altered. But if you take it at face value, one of the things that I speculated about early in my research is maybe the right side of the head did open up, as you tend to see in the Zapruder film. And in the process of retrieving some of the brain matter from the back of the car and then getting back down in the seat, maybe Jackie reached over and closed it. Just snapped it closed. We don't know because all of her interviews are, off limits. We don't know what she recalled, and she was probably at that moment in a state of shock and may not have even recalled that she did it. It's a possibility. And the other thing is, there are some witnesses that said that you could see a ridge underneath the scalp, such as, bone partially protruding, or maybe an unevenness in the scalp caused by a fracture. So at the end of the day, we just don't know. And the thing I really wanted to focus on is I think this is a worthy endeavor, but I go back to why the decoy ambulance, at least one, possibly 2 decoy ambulances, why the shipping casket delivery, which was made prior to the motorcade arriving from Andrews with Jackie in the Dallas casket. And I think Horn correctly concludes after all of his years of research, as many of us have, is that this was all done so that there could be a pre-exam, which was conducted by Horn and Boswell, to remove the evidence of frontal shots, remove bullets or bullet fragments. All of that was done during the pre-exam. Now, in Bethesda 101, and I'll conclude here with, so we can get on with others, Rick Russo and I went into this in depth, and I think Rick has found the linchpin in all of this with his discovery of the old morgue and the interview with Robert Carney. And he contends, I think rightfully so, that the pre-exam was actually done in the old morgue, not in the new morgue. And we do know that Reed and Custer saw Humes take a scalpel to the skull and then a bone saw to cut across the frontal bone of the skull. and that was not seen by Jenkins or O'Connor. So it does support the idea that it was done in a separate room, and Rick introduces a lot of other stuff. We will have, I've had several long discussions with Rick in the last week. We will have a Bethesda 102 on this coming up. And I'll just conclude with one other thing. I think, and we didn't have this in Bethesda 101, and I think I stumbled across this recently, just going back through and just thinking through all the things that were happening. Reed and Custer went to the 4th floor tower to the x-ray department, and they brought down a large, bulky x-ray machine to the morgue. This thing was massive, heavy, difficult to wheel down the hall, and not easy to position. In fact, I think Custer's the one who makes the point that they didn't get a good lateral x-ray from one side of the body because they had difficulty, and that suggests that this machine was difficult to position because of its size. I asked Jim Jenkins at Lancer several years back, did you normally take x-rays in the morgue as routine, part of an autopsy? And he said, we did. And I said, well, what unit did you use? And he said, well, there's a portable unit stationed right there in the morgue. We use that machine. And I told Rick recently, I said, I just missed it at the time. I didn't make the connection. Why are Reed and Custer bringing a large, bulky machine down from the x-ray department to the morgue when there's already a portable unit there? And the answer to that is, when they opened the new morgue in the summer of '63, they brought the x-ray machine that was in the old morgue over to the new morgue. So the old morgue on November 22nd doesn't have a unit. Hence, Reed and Custer brought that machine. And as Rick lays out, these people and this activity took place in the old morgue, and this is what happened in the new morgue, and that was all part of his presentation. We'll retrace that in Bethesda 102. So I think that's the really important stuff to talk about. And there's always going to be discrepancy, I think, among researchers. And in fact, there was between Horn and Mantic for quite a while. They disagreed on some things. I think they're coalescing now. But anyway, those are my comments. But so far, a very good presentation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for your comments, Brooks. I mean, for those of you on the call today who haven't seen Bethesda 101 that Brooks and Rick did in the spring of this year, it's uploaded on our YouTube channel. It was a really interesting talk. It was not just the old morgue revelation, but other revelations as well that were really interesting. So I do urge you to go back and review that if you haven't seen it so far. I definitely look forward to hearing from you, Brooks, on 102 whenever you can do that. On the second,
well, Rick and I have some discrepancies as far as the later activities that night. So we're trying to iron those out, but we do agree. I think we strongly agree on the old morgue scenario for the pre-exam.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, if you can, you can come together, it'd be great to hear from you at some point in 2025. And I know you're going to do something for us in the summer as well to complete your trilogy. On the second point, well, there's been 1 million hours allegedly put into trying to solve this, head wound or JFK wound problem. We've got an hour to go on this presentation. Maybe Tony will make a lot of progress on this, and we'll see about that. Paul, you've got a question?
Just a comment, really. I had a quick look during the break at the Kilduff press conference, and at the point he actually points, I would say it's probably equidistant, the point on his head where he pointed between where Tony's points. So I don't think that I mean, he can't be exact, but he doesn't. He says temple. That he quotes temple later in the press conference, but at the actual point he's pointing, he says, "Where's it gone? Find it." He says through the head,
Right.
but the actual point of his head where it's sort of there.
So some equidistance between the two points that Tony has put in the diagram. Okay, no, well, thank you for clarifying that, Paul. Tim, you've got a question? Tim, you're on mute.
Yeah, is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Firstly, I think it's an excellent talk so far. My first question is, Boswell says to the ARRB there was a huge amount of skull bone missing. And if that's correct, I can't help wondering how the head would maintain its shape. And I think if I remember rightly, when they were at Parkland, doesn't the neurologist sort of picks up Kennedy's head and has a look at it and said, there's no hope here? Presumably, if there'd been that amount of bone missing, it would have been obvious to him, wouldn't it? And the other point, so I was going to ask you before we started, but I don't need to, is all these lacerations, why we can't see them on the photographs, but you've now explained that. So thank you very much for that.
Okay. I don't think there was as much bone missing across the top of the head onto the left side as Boswell suggests. I think there was some. I think his verbal description of 30 to 40% going over is probably more accurate, because when he drew on the skull, it was an absolutely huge area. And I agree with you that it doesn't seem likely. I mean, it could be he was describing what he saw after Dr. Humes had already tinkered with the body. I don't know, but I think it unlikely that there would have been that enormous amount of bone loss that he put in that picture. All right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Shall I press on now?
Yeah, I don't think there's any more questions, Tony. So please go ahead.
Right, I'll just put you onto slideshow now. Okay. Part 3, where was the rear entry wound? There are contradictory views as to where the rear entry wound was located. The autopsy report version is that there was an entry wound 2.5 centimeters to the right and just above the EOP. EOP is the external occipital protuberance. It's basically the bump at the back of your head in the midline. It's the EOP. And they said that the bullet went through the occipital bone. But the HSCA forensic panel decided that the wound was 10 centimeters higher than this, and the bullet went through the right parietal bone. So which is the correct version? The HSCA had evidence for a high entry wound as follows. They noted that the autopsy photographs of the brain showed intact cerebellum. They argued that a low shot would be so close to the cerebellum that it would inevitably damage that structure. However, this was invalidated by autopsy photographer John Stringer. He attended a brain examination carried out by Drs. Humes and Boswell 3 days after the assassination. He testified to the ARRB and he was shown the photographs that he supposedly took. He told them that he had seen damaged cerebellum, but the photographs did not show this. He told them that he photographed brain sections that were made during the examination, but these were missing. He also said that he did not take any basilar views of the brain, but the photographs from the archives included these views. John Stringer testified that he had used Ektachrome color-positive transparency film made by Kodak to take his color picture. But the film he was shown did not have the Kodak trademark or the characteristic notches for the E3 film which should have been present. Black and white film from the archives could be identified by Stringer as Ansco press pack film, but he did not use this type of film. He always used Kodak for his professional work, not Ansco. The conclusion here is that Stringer did not take the brain photographs in the archives, and the brain he saw had damaged cerebellum. If this evidence is not damning enough, consider what Dr. Robert Kirshner testified. He was a world-class forensic pathologist used as a consultant for the ARRB. He was shown the brain photographs, and he said that the color and texture of the brain showed that it had been preserved in formaldehyde for 2 to 3 weeks. This was the brain that Stringer supposedly photographed only 3 days after Kennedy had died. We have to conclude that the brain photographs are not those of Kennedy, and John Stringer said he saw a brain with damaged cerebellum at the examination. The lateral skull x-rays show a high trail of bullet fragments, and the HSCA said that this confirmed a high entry for a bullet that went straight through the skull. However, the trail starts 2 centimeters above the proposed entry site. Also, large numbers of tiny fragments are at the front end of this trail, which is consistent with a bullet traveling from front to back, not a bullet entering the back of the head high on the skull. HSCA expert radiologist Russell Morgan claimed that X-rays showed a hole high in the skull at the back of the head. However, the ARRB consultant, a forensic pathologist named John Fitzpatrick, said that there was no such hole visible on the X-rays. Now, Dr. Michael Chesser, who's seen the original X-rays, and many of his medical colleagues have noted the same thing, that the hole is just not visible. Also, there is no typical fracture pattern around the proposed high entry wound. This only leaves us with the autopsy photographs showing a high entry wound. But there is evidence that these photographs are bogus, as we will see. This photograph of the back of the head is highly suspect. 16 Parkland physicians did not recognize this as showing what they saw. Staff at Bethesda Naval Hospital reported damage in this area not visible in this photograph. Secret Service agents Sybert and O'Neill suggested the photograph had been doctored or reconstructed in some way. Sandra K. Spencer developed film at the Naval Photographic Center in Anacostia, Washington, D.C. for the Secret Service. She developed a version of this photograph that showed a hole in the back of the head. Joe O'Donnell was shown a photograph by William Knutson showing a hole in the back of the head. And Dennis David was shown a photograph by William Pitzer, again showing a wound in the back of the head. There is some evidence that this photograph was altered. Now, Calvin McCamey, an expert in photography working for the HSCA, said that the autopsy photographs were legitimate, and stereoscopic viewing of paired photographs confirmed this. However, when Robert Groden did stereoscopic viewing of paired photographs, he saw evidence of photographic alteration. David Mantic went to the National Archives and he confirmed these findings on all paired photograph images of the back of the head. Everything looked three-dimensional on stereoscopic viewing, except a flat area that appeared over the back of the head where witnesses reported seeing a hole. And evident for a low entry point is that all 3 pathologists testified to this. The autopsy report also relates the entry wound to a fixed anatomical landmark, the EOP, so it should be correct. Damage to the cerebellum was confirmed by Dr. Jenkins, Dr. McClellan, and Dr. Clark, again consistent with a low entry wound. Now, Dr. Kemp Clark was the head of neurosurgery, so he should know what cerebellum looks like. Recently, forensic pathologist Dr. Peter Cummings has said that there is a pattern of radiating primary fractures on the X-ray consistent with a low entry point. Also, there are some witnesses who report seeing a low entry wound through the scalp. That was Roy Kellerman of the Secret Service and Richard Lipsey, aide to General Well. So to summarize, the evidence for a high entry wound is based on unreliable photographs and misinterpretation of X-rays. Evidence from witnesses and correct interpretation of X-rays show that the entry wound on the back of the head was in fact low down through the occipital bone and close to the external occipital protuberance. Now, part 4. What was the nature of the rear entry wound? The Dr. Boswell version is shown by his ARRB testimony, where he is asked about a circle with an arrow coming out of it and going upwards and to the left that can be seen on the autopsy face sheet. Boswell, in the scalp, there was a tunneling wound through the skin and subcutaneous tissue, and I think that is the direction the tunnel went. Question, does that mean there was a tunnel between the entrance point and the point where the bullet entered the skull? Boswell, yes. When asked about how long the tunnel was, Boswell stated that he believed that the tunnel was about 1.5 centimeters in length. The Dr. Hume's version is very different, as seen in his ARB testimony. Question, what was your understanding of the correlation, if any, between a puncture wound in the scalp and the puncture wound in the bone? Hume's, they're directly aligned. Question, so there was not a penetration of the scalp with a bullet going along the cranium and then going in at some. Hume's, my impression was that it went straight through from the site of the skin wound when you looked at the wound from the inside and matched up with the scalp wound. So, was there a tunneling wound? If Dr. Humes was correct that the bullet should have punched through the scalp and bone, leaving a neat regular hole, the wound in the scalp and the wound in the skull should be roughly the same size and shape. However, the skull wound at autopsy was nearly round, but the scalp wound was oval in shape, 6 millimeters by 15 millimeters. This is consistent with a bullet entry angle of 24 degrees to the skin surface. We can see this in this picture. The bullet entry angle is consistent with a tunneling wound. The scalp thickness is shown as 8 millimeters. This is a population average for the thickness of scalp over the occipital bone. Kennedy was a tall man, so the scalp could have been thicker than this. In this picture, we see the hole through the scalp does not overlap the wound through the skull at all. This is consistent with a tunneling wound. Loss of bone above the skull entry point. Bullets going through a skull nearly perpendicular to the surface usually punch a hole through the bone and leave cracks that radiate around the hole. Bullets that go through the skull at an acute angle do the same thing, but they are more likely to blast out bone above the entry point as well. Now, Hume said that this did not happen, but Dr. Boswell said it did happen, and the face sheet he made at the autopsy shows the bone fragment. The arrow points to it. So Dr. Boswell's version appears to be correct. There could be another piece of occipital bone just above this fragment that was blasted out. I will let you think about that for a few seconds as to what that occipital bone might have been. And the answer is the half a fragment. If a bullet tunneled upward through the scalp tissue, then you would expect the entry wound to be lower down than the EOP. There are 2 witnesses who reported seeing a low entry wound through the scalp just above the hairline. That was Richard Lipsey, the aide to General Well, and Roy Kellerman, the Secret Service agent. There are no independent witnesses who reported seeing an entry wound close to the EOP. Okay, how do we explain these findings? The autopsy report said that the wound was lacerated. Well, this is not unusual. The autopsy face sheet says that the wound was ragged. Well, this is unusual. A bullet is streamlined and typically punches out a neat hole through the scalp on entry. Also, based on the shape of the holes, the entry wound through the scalp was 24 degrees to the surface, but the entry wound through the skull was about 90 degrees to the surface. So how did this happen? My answer is that it was a tumbling bullet. The bullet enters the skin at a narrow upward angle and tunnels up through the scalp. The bullet is rapidly rotating and it is about 90 degrees to the surface as it penetrates the skull. The rotating bullet pulls up the skin faster than its natural elasticity can tolerate. This causes multiple minute lacerations, giving the wound a ragged look. It also causes one longer laceration that is recorded in the autopsy report. Let's just summarize this section. All the available evidence tells us that there was an upward tunneling wound through the scalp below the EOP. This was made by a tumbling bullet on an upward trajectory. What does this entry wound tell us? The wound was caused by a bullet traveling upwards at an angle of about 24 degrees to the surface of the skin. A bullet fired from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository would come down at an angle of 15 degrees to the horizontal, according to the Warren Commission. The diagram on the left shows the impossibility of this shot causing the explosive head damage at Zapruder film 313. The wound must have been caused at a later time when Kennedy's head was tilted forwards nearly 90 degrees, as shown in the diagram on the right. This shows that Kennedy was shot in the head at least twice. Was this why Humes came up with a different type of wound? Was he trying to disguise this? Why would the bullet be tumbling? Well, one possibility is that the bullet brushed against the upper part of Kennedy's jacket, as shown in this picture, and this caused the bullet to start tumbling. Another possibility is that a bullet fitted with a sabot was fired at Kennedy, and there was imperfect separation of the sabot from the bullet. Now, Jim Mars wrote in his book Crossfire, this 30.06 bullet has been fitted with a sabot, a small plastic device which allows a smaller caliber slug to be fired from a larger shell casing. Using such a device, the smaller slug will have increased velocity. The smaller slug could also have been previously fired and recovered, resulting in ballistic markings which match the original weapon and not the 30.06 which fired the sabot slug. Peter Antill reminded me that a 30.0 shell casing indicating the use of a sabot was found in the 1970s on the roof of the Dallas County Records building overlooking Dealey Plaza. So there is some evidence to support this idea. So what happened to the bullet that struck the back of the head? The tumbling bullet hits the bone above the entry point side on. The force from the bullet rips out bone above the entry point. The middle section of the bullet would experience an equal and opposite force from the skull bone. The bullet would be ripped into 2 halves, one half traveling outside the skull and the other traveling inside the skull. The 2 halves of a bullet would end up somewhere in the front of the limousine. Were two halves of one bullet recovered from the front part of the limousine? Yes, this is well documented. What happened to the bullet fragment traveling inside the skull? I believe the bullet traveled upwards through the right half of the skull and exited the top front area of the skull adjacent to the coronal suture where the HSCA said a bullet exited. The half bullet pushed through the scalp flaps near the front of the head on the right side. The half bullet could have gone through the blob of brain matter on the outside of the skull and caused an explosion of blood and brain matter, particularly down the right side of the interior of the limousine. There are witness statements that confirm this is how the limousine looked after the assassination. Please note that the half bullet would shed numerous lead fragments from what had been the middle of the bullet as it traveled through the skull. Okay, part 5. What caused the trail of metal fragments seen on the X-rays? Okay, let's first ask, in terms of anatomy, where exactly were the metal fragments? When I first saw the X-rays, I thought the metal fragments were through the brain. This is not the case because the brain has been completely blasted out of this area. Were they in the skull bones? Well, no, because again, most of the bone in this area had been blasted out as well. Could the fragments be in the scalp? This is really the only remaining option. If you look at the X-rays on the left there, you can see a trail of fragments end on, and I'll just get the pointer. Here are metal fragments seen from front to back, the fragments look piled up here, and you will notice that the lower edge of these fragments has a smooth curve to it. On the picture on the right, I have added Kennedy's face to help you orientate the X-ray, and I have added scalp in the form of a pink area over the top of the head. You can see the scalp dipping into the area where the skull has been blasted out. You can see the metal fragments embedded in the scalp. Because the lower edge of the scalp has a smooth curve from left to right, the fragments in the lower part of the scalp will have a smooth curve as well. If the fragments are in the scalp, how did they get there? Did the bullet go straight through the scalp? Well, no. A bullet going through the scalp would be like a plow going through wet earth. There would have been a deep, wide rip through the scalp that everyone would have seen, and this is not the case. Also, another bullet would be required to go into the skull to blast out the skull bone. Did the bullet travel through the brain and then spray out metal fragments that went up into the scalp? Well, no. The skull bone would have been between the brain and the scalp and would act as a shield that would stop the fragments reaching the scalp. So we will just have to think about this question for the moment. How did the fragments get there? If we look at the lateral X-ray here on the left, it's hard to see that the fragments are on this sort of reproduction. On the right side, I have represented the trail of fragments as black dots on the picture, representing Kennedy's head, so you can see more clearly where they would be located. Here is one of the contradictions we were looking at. On the left, there is a red arrow through the trail of fragments as seen on the X-ray. On the right is a red arrow showing where the trail of fragments was according to the autopsy report. You can see from this that the autopsy description written by Dr. Humes is completely false. You can see from these pictures that the trail of fragments on the lateral X-rays does not match well with the trajectory proposed by the HSCA forensic panel. The start of the proposed trajectory is 2 centimeters below the X-ray trail, and it is at a different angle to the fragment trail. In fact, the position of the fragment trail does not seem to match up well with any trajectory. At the time of the explosive headshot, that's Zapruder frame 313, Kennedy's head was tilted forwards at about 27 degrees to a true vertical line. If we tilt our picture based on the lateral X-ray forward by 27 degrees, we see the problem. The middle picture here assumes the trail was formed from back to front. You can see that the downward angle is so steep, even a shot from the top of the tallest building behind the limousine would still require a marked downward deflection to cause the trail of metal fragments. The right picture assumes the trail was formed from front to back from a frontal shot. Any bullet from in front of the limousine would require a large upward deflection on entering the skull to cause the trail of metal fragments. So we have two problems here. One, it is hard to explain how the fragments got into the scalp. And two, it is hard to match the line of fragments to a plausible bullet trajectory. So what is the answer? Okay, well, let's now consider a different possibility. The front half of a bullet is traveling up inside the skull, as discussed earlier. Behind the half bullet, small metal fragments are being flung out in its wake. The skull bone on the right side above the moving bullet has already been blasted out by an earlier shot. The flap edges open slightly from internal pressure. Some bullet fragments penetrate these edges and get trapped there. If this idea is correct, then the long frontal laceration here that was described by Dr. Boswell would have to match closely with the position of the trail of metal fragments that is seen on the X-ray. Well, let us see if this is the case. You can see there is a close correlation between the position of the long laceration described by Dr. Boswell and the trail of metal fragments seen on the lateral X-ray. If you consider that the scalp is probably dipping into the area of missing bone, the correlation is probably better than you think. So you can imagine here that these fragments are actually dipping in, is where the scalp's dipping in. So it looks like there is a good correlation. Any supporting evidence to what I'm saying? We could ask the question, could any of the fragments have gone into another flap edge? What about this lower edge? What about here? Could any of metal fragments got in that edge there? Can we look at the lateral X-ray and see a line of fragments at this position? The answer is yes. There are 4 metal fragments seen here that have been confirmed by Dr. David Mantic to be metal. He did this when he went to the archives. He did a survey of metallic fragments in the skull, and there were definitely 4 metal fragments at this position. And we can see that they form a perfect straight line. If we extend this line forward, it meets the line drawn through the fragment trail that we have been talking about. The place where the 2 lines meet is the area of frontal bone where Dr. Michael Chesser found X-ray evidence for a bullet entry. I believe these two lines, here and here, represent 2 edges of one of the scalp flaps. To summarize the last point, the bullet entering near the EOP was ripped into two halves. The top half went inside the skull, going forwards and upwards. This half bullet shed fragments on the way through. Some metal fragments got caught in the edges of a flap formed by a previous shot. The trail of metal fragments does not correspond to a bullet trajectory, as everyone has previously assumed. Okay, summary and final conclusions. At this point, we will return to the list of contradictions I presented at the beginning, and I will try to resolve all of them. Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell described the ARRB scalp wounds that contradicted descriptions they made in the autopsy report. Explanation: Dr. Humes probably tried to hide the fact that there was an exit wound at the back of the head by making it a small part of a large wound on the right side of the head. Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell revealed to the ARRB that the area of scalp loss was only a few centimeters across, and showed that the autopsy report of an area of absent scalp and bone approximately 13 centimeters across was in fact a lie. The interesting finding here is that their testimonies to the ARRB, when combined with mortician Tom Robinson's, show that Kennedy had an exit wound at the back of the head a few centimeters across. The autopsy report and Dr. Boswell contradict each other in the description of the skull wounds. Explanation: Dr. Humes was probably avoiding describing bone loss across the top of the skull and over into the left side of the top of the skull because he knew this might be due to an exit wound from a frontal shot. Dr. Boswell did not worry about this, and his version is more consistent with the X-rays. Interesting findings: loss of bone from the top of the head and on the left side is consistent with a right frontal shot from the grassy knoll area. Humes and Boswell both described bone loss from the back of the head on the right. This is consistent with a frontal head shot exiting this area. Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell contradict each other on their description of the entry wound at the back of the head when they testified to the ARRB. Explanation: Dr. Humes was probably trying to promote a version of the entry wound consistent with a sniper firing from above and behind the limousine. The physical evidence and testimony of other witnesses supports Dr. Boswell's version that there was an upward tunnel through the scalp at the back of the head. Interesting finding: the available evidence suggests that a bullet entering the back of the head suggests that a bullet entered the back of the head on an upward trajectory. The autopsy report and the HSCA forensic panel contradicted each other regarding the position of the entry wound at the back of the head. Explanation: the HSCA used unreliable autopsy photographs and their interpretation of the X-rays was incorrect. The three pathologists agreed on a low entry wound, and correct X-ray interpretation, confirmed cerebellar damage, and independent witness testimony all support this view. Interesting finding: there was an entry wound low down on the back of the head where a bullet entered at an upward angle and it was tumbling. The explosive head wound of frame 313 of the Zapruder film could not have been caused by the bullet that struck the back of the head. Autopsy photographs appear to contradict observations made by medical staff at Parkland Hospital. The autopsy photographs in question are bogus because these photographs show no exit wound at the back of the head. Over 80 witnesses contacted by Robert Groden said that they saw an exit wound at the back of the head, including trained staff at Parkland Hospital. Some witnesses reported seeing versions of the autopsy photographs of the back of the head showing damage that is not seen in the photographs in the National Archives. Stereoscopic viewing shows clear evidence for alterations being made to the photographs. autopsy photographs contradict descriptions found in the autopsy report. The autopsy report says that an area of complete loss of skull and scalp was present on the right side of the head, but extended to the back of the head on the right side. This defect is not present on autopsy photographs. Explanation: the evidence suggests that the photographs were doctored to disguise an exit wound at the back of the head and to show a fake entry wound that never existed. Interesting point is that the forgers ended up contradicting the autopsy report. So that was not very clever. There's a Pruder film shows skull fragments being expelled from the top of the head, but nobody at Parkland Hospital reported seeing an exit wound in this area. The bullet entry from a frontal headshot caused skull flaps to form and spring open in a tiny fraction of a second. Skull fragments were expelled when the flaps were open. Scalp flaps snapped back to their original position. With the flaps closed, the doctors at Parkland Hospital saw intact-looking scalp over the top of the head. X-rays show a line of bullet fragments that occupies a different position to that described in the autopsy report. Explanation: the bullet fragments from the brain on the right side could have been removed before the autopsy started. However, some bullet fragments were missed because they were trapped in the scalp flap edges and not seen. However, they were easily visible on the X-rays. The 3 autopsy pathologists had all identified a low entry point, so Dr. Hume simply lied about the trail of fragments going upwards from this wound on the back of the head. Okay, so I am proposing 3 headshots. The first shot was fired from the fence at the top of the grassy knoll. It struck the frontal bone on the right side of the head, just below the hairline. It exited from the top of the skull to the left of the midline. The middle picture shows the position of blood spatter from the head. Once we recognize that the burst injury blood spatter is not related to the bullet trajectory, we can see that the forward spatter and the back spatter confirms a frontal shot from the right. The blood spatter picture clearly shows that the explosive headshot could not have been caused by a shot being fired from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. The second headshot hit the right temple from the front. This caused the exit wound in the back of the head on the right side. The third headshot was fired from somewhere behind the limousine. It entered the scalp low down at the back of the head on the right side on an upward trajectory. It was tumbling and split into 2 on penetrating the skull. This shot was responsible for the 2 halves of a bullet found in the front of the limousine after the assassination. We have looked at various contradictions associated with the autopsy of President Kennedy, specifically relating to his head wounds. It appears that these came about as a result of evidence tampering, evidence substitution, failure of the HSCA forensic panel to correctly interpret photographs and X-rays, and also lies told by autopsy pathologists. However, having now resolved these contradictions, we can now conclude that President Kennedy was shot through the head 3 times. The shots came from behind and in front of the limousine. And if you didn't know it, President Kennedy was assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening.
No, that was very good, Tony. Thank you. That was very much a good hour, going back to Brooks's point. Right, let's open this for questions. Anybody have a question to start with? Tony Power.
Sorry, I was just giving him a round of applause there, Neil. Sorry, that
Oh.
wasn't my hand going. That was a clap.
Sorry, I misunderstood the icon. Okay. Brooks, you still with us? Do you want to comment on the second half at all? Anything there that you feel strongly about?
I see a common thread with this presentation and the vast majority of talks that we experience in the research community. And when Rick and I talked the other night, and we were kind of critiquing our original presentation on Bethesda 101, I said, you know, we really need to go back and start over and say, what do we know and what do we not know? And separate the facts, the observations, and everything into two groups. Build your case entirely on what we know, because what we don't know becomes speculation. And we're all prone to speculation. I've done it in many of my presentations. Rick did it a lot in Bethesda 101. And the interesting thing about whether you're studying any aspect of this case, be it the Tippett murder, Oswald's escape from Dealey Plaza, the medical evidence, and so forth, once you start to speculate, there's only one true set of facts, right? So wherever you start to speculate along that journey, you're taking a detour. You know, you're kind of going off in a different direction. And I would posit that there are unlimited opportunities to do that. And then that's where all the debate takes place, because we start fighting among each other over the points of speculation. I think there's a lot of good stuff in this presentation, and I think we'll revisit some of that maybe in Bethesda 102. But what Rick and I are also going to do is we're going to kind of start over and basically build our case in Bethesda 102 to say, what do we absolutely know to be virtually irrefutable? And then to be honest and say, okay, we're going to go out on a limb and we're going to speculate here and speculate there and try to fill in the blanks. Because at the end of the day, just the medical evidence alone, what happened at Parkland, what happened en route to Washington, and then what happened at Bethesda is like a 5,000 piece jigsaw puzzle. And we only know for sure where 3,000 to 4,000 of those pieces fit the puzzle. And the rest of it we're guessing on. And we're all free to guess and come up with our theories. Some interesting stuff today, Tony. I'll give you, I've done a lot of work in this area myself. So it's difficult to really try to piece together. We have the autopsy report. We have the witnesses that were at Bethesda and their observations. And we have all the testimony that Humes and Boswell gave, not only to the Warren Commission, but the ARB, HSCA. Let's circle back to one irrefutable fact. There was a pre-exam done at Bethesda to alter the wounds and to cover up the fact that Kennedy was shot from the front. Humes and Boswell participated in that. They had full knowledge of that. Therefore, we can conclude at some point they have to not only promote the cover-up, but they have to be very careful about what they say and do. And once you start telling a lie, then you start spinning a web, right? It's always easy to tell the truth because you just, as you're asked to go back and review what happened, if you always tell the truth, you're never going to wander. The problem with Humes and Boswell is they start contradicting themselves because they're caught up in a web of lies. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, good point. But they probably can't remember what they lied about.
No, can I just say it is an extremely difficult area, and it's sometimes it feels like you're a detective who's gone to a crime scene, and it's a very difficult crime scene. But then you're told that the crime scene has been tampered with, so it then becomes doubly difficult. No, it's a very difficult area. I've spent a long time trying to figure out things to do with this, and I I'm just putting forward theories and ideas that they might not be correct. They might be correct, but it's just to keep people thinking and keep trying to move towards the final answer. Okay, Neil.
No, thank you. Scott, do you have a question?
Yeah, I mean it's part question, part comment, really. Obviously, I saw the presentation at Canterbury and I was highly impressed, and it's great to see it again. Obviously, if Kennedy's shot twice in the head, sorry, 3 times in the head, twice from the front, once from behind. He's also shot in the back, and in the throat. So we're talking about like 5. He's been hit at least 5 times. But I was interested in the frontal shot because my interest is in not the grassy knoll as such, but the south knoll. And I think one of Tony's, I think I can just see the slide a little bit. 127. It might be one. No, it's 128. It is that one. And the reason I'm interested in it, and it is around Sherry Feaster's analysis, is that, and I know this is just a representation on the slide, but the car in that picture is kind of going like straight on, I feel like, where in fact I would say that the car in that analysis there should be slanted to the left.
Yeah, no, that's fair comment. Yeah, I wouldn't rule out a shot from the south knoll entirely.
Yeah, that if you do that, if we do move the car and almost to like 45 degrees, then it opens up the right front, not as being the grassy knoll, but as being the south knoll. And I think that's a much more likely position for an assassin to be placed. And that was just a comment I had on that when I saw that slide. I think we have to realise that the car was not going parallel down Elm Street. It was almost, if the cars had travelled straight, it would have actually ended up on the south knoll if it had carried on in that direction. And I don't know.
You are correct on that. Yes, yeah.
I don't know if that opens up any other analysis in terms of, I mean, I'm a lay person in this regard, in terms of, the trajectory of the bullets and things like that, because we're predicating a lot of it on that it's come from the famous grassy knoll rather than the other side of the plaza.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that.
Okay, Nancy, you have a question?
Yes, I do. In your analysis, how do you incorporate the order of the shots in terms of, as you see what happens with creation of flaps, the bone damage, the trail of metal, fragments, etc.? It's got to matter what order the shots came in, right? Because the condition of the head is going to be different after each shot. And were you able to determine, did anything happen simultaneously, or the order of the shots based on how the head looked?
I would say that the first headshot was the explosive one that you see on the Zapruder film, 313. I would say that's definitely the first shot. The second and third shots, I put the second one as the one that went through the temple. I'm to be honest, I'm not sure whether the sequence of the second and third is correct. It would need more work as to exactly where they would have come from and the time sequence.
Can I jump in on that, Neil?
Yes, please. Yes, please, Brooke.
Yeah, I think Sherry Feaster was the one who really did thorough examination on this, because it's based on the way, I think where Nancy's getting at is there are fractures that emanate from the entry point into the skull that that go out radially, and then you have circumferential rings around that. And so you have series of fractures, both radial and circumferential, that you see from a wound. And then when there's a subsequent shot that enters the skull after that, those fractures, as they emanate, can't jump the gap that's already been created by a prior fracture. So there's a sequence of that. And for that reason, Horn and Mantic say that the first shot entered the back of the skull based on what you see of the fractures on the x-ray, which is consistent with the point Sherry was trying to make in terms of her analysis. I'm not sure, I can't remember what her sequence was, but Horn and Mantic now say the first shot entered the back of the skull.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that, because according to my version, the head was tilted forward 90 degrees for that shot from behind. So my version doesn't agree with that, but
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, then, okay, so I understand that's just like what Brooks was saying about there's certain facts and evidence, and then we interpret them a certain way, and then that begs our discussion, right? About whether it leads us to conclusion A or conclusion B. So there's still more work to be done on that then, right?
Yes, I would say so, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm not the one to do it. Okay. So I'm looking at you and Brooks and Rick and you folks to I will task you with that job going forward to continue your great efforts. The second questions that I have is, have you done anything on not to say that you haven't been working hard, okay, but have you done anything on the other wounds? Like, how did Connolly get hit? Is there anything that tells us about what the wounds that entered JFK that would have had the ability to continue on into Connolly and inflict that kind of damage? And then, of course, the throat wound and the what we know about that. What's the latest on that?
Well, I haven't done a presentation on the other wounds yet. I can tell you that the bullet that hit Connolly cannot have been the same bullet that went through Kennedy. And I say that because every time they've done an experiment using bullets and synthetic models, the bullet always comes out the throat area tumbling, and it's tumbling in a vertical plane. And the wound on the back of Connolly was actually 1.5 centimeters across, and it was elongated in a horizontal plane. And we know that because the HSCA, I forget the man's name, is a forensic, heading the forensics, went to see Governor John Connolly and looked at his back and did a written description of his back, and the wound was horizontal. So a tumbling wound in a tumbling bullet in a vertical plane coming forwards is not going to cause a wound that is a side-to-side horizontal wound. So they must have been two different bullets.
Okay, so that's going to bring us then to a minimum of 6 shots, as I call it, from what I'm hearing with everything that happened in the plaza. You've got the 3 into JFK that have been described, and then we've got, how did Tag get wounded? Okay, across the plaza, the Connolly, and then the curb grass, the mark in the curb, and is that associated with the grass bullet and those type of things. So I'm counting like a minimum of 6. Is that what we kind of have so far then?
Well, plus
I
plus
think
the back
so.
plus the back shot, Nancy.
The back
The
shot.
spine to the right of the spine.
Right.
C3. Plus you can throw in some diversion shots if you like as well.
Plus, we can use Roy Kellerman's own words. He told the Warren Commission that at the point of the fatal shot to the head, that a flurry of shells came into the limousine.
Mm.
Those are his words, a flurry of shells.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
There's a lot of shots.
Neil, can I just add, is it not the case as well in terms of the Connolly shooting that the doctors did a press conference or some form of a press conference on the evening of the 22nd and said that the bullet was still in Connolly's body? They were still treating him, and at that time the so-called magic bullet, which they were saying was still in Connolly's body, was on its way to Washington. So none of that stacks up at all.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, I mean, just on the note regarding your point, Nancy, with respect to a presentation on perhaps the throat shot or perhaps Connolly's wounds or the rear shot, I'm trying to strong arm Tony into doing something on that next year. Actually, and this is probably quite a good segue to make an announcement. I know that we've had a few drop off. We are going ahead with the one and only seminar next summer in Warwickshire at the end of June. I haven't been able to put out an email quite yet. I only spoke to the hotel at the end of last week, I think Thursday, I think it was. And they conceded. So at the moment, we do have 23 full weekend participants and we have 3 partial participants. So if there's anybody still on this call who hasn't confirmed either way or is considering it, I see that Matt Humphries has just dropped off sadly because he wasn't able to come. But please reach out to me. There will be. I'll probably put an email out tomorrow actually, because I think I've been pretty good actually. Bringing down the threshold for this event to go ahead. And I'm going to open it up via our Facebook page and our DPUK website as well to see if we can get some other people that would like to attend. I mean, there's so much advance notice on this. You'd think that we would gradually fill out, but if there are any members on this call that are undecided, it would be great if we could fill out the numbers, just because, I mean, we've got several people coming from overseas. Nancy's coming from the States, Gary Severson and his wife, both of whom want to speak. Robert Mance, who joined us in Canterbury this year, he's coming back. And we've got a new member from Finland that's coming. So I really feel that we ought to, make a really big effort for the one event next year. And it is, to mark the 30th anniversary. So when I do post this on our YouTube channel, again, this will go out to other people. So I just want to confirm that it is going ahead. You'll probably get an email tomorrow. At the moment, we've got a lot of response in terms of people that want to present. Some really good speakers. Nancy, Brooks, both of whom I love. We've got Scott, we've got Johnny, we've got Bill Simpich. Paul Abbott wants to come back and talk. Gary Severson is going to do a talk. I mean, the Grodens have offered to. Simon James, Bart Camp wants to do a couple of talks. This is, if Malcolm does turn up, we'll probably interview him as well. So this is going to be a really good event. So if anyone's undecided, please reach out to me. And I've the hotel have been really good on extending the offer on rooms as well. Okay, Scott, you've still got your hand raised. Is that an old question?
No, it's a new question.
You're only allowed 3 questions, Scott.
Okay, this is my last one. It was just, well, we've got Brooks on again, because Tony in his presentation had a slide of Kennedy's body. It was a kind of profile of Kennedy's head during the autopsy, and I just seem to recall when Rick did his presentation sometime last year that there was some concern about perhaps that isn't actually JFK. And I wondered if Brooks was able to kind of expand on that. or just refreshes on it?
Sure. I just want to I'll talk on that just briefly, and then two other quick points. Yeah, Rick has a photo of JFK taken at Fort Worth that morning on the 22nd, which he has manipulated and laid horizontally. He compares Kennedy's left ear to that photo, that left lateral in the autopsy, and the ears look distinctly different. But I think Rick's big contention is we know that they've altered the photo of the back of the head to hide the wound that was there, which Tony had covered nicely in the presentation today. And then they've also altered the x-ray with the white patch to hide the fact that there's missing bone there at the back of the head. So if they've already altered one photo and one x-ray for sure, that's irrefutable. How many of these photos and x-rays did they alter? Rick believes a lot of them are altered, and he makes the point that perhaps that body that we see on the left lateral, the ear doesn't match Kennedy's. Now it looks like there's a facial overlay. They were very clever in how they reconstructed and did a lot of this work with these alterations. But that's the one comment I would make there. Quickly on the South Knoll, Sherry Feaster has, based on her presentation in her book, she has the shot coming from in the vicinity of the South Knoll, and she made the point that it came on a downward trajectory, went over the top of the windshield, and struck Kennedy in the I believe that shot was in the right forehead. But I've done the math on that because I have a topographical survey of Dealey Plaza, and when you do the math on that, you'd have to be about 16 feet above grade minimum, standing on the overpass at that level in order to clear the top of the windshield. So that shot doesn't work. You'd have to be over on the South Knoll. Now there's no picket fence over there like there is in the North Knoll, but you'd have to be over there where you can see some of the cars parked in the Cancelleri photo. You'd have to be over there coming at a wider angle, or potentially, believe it or not, there's a storm drain on Main Street that would afford a shot to the right forehead at the appropriate moment. So there are some possibilities for a shot emanating from the south side there. And the last thing about the throat wound, in chapter 5 of his most recent book, Mantic wrote, I think, the final analysis with Jerome Corsi. He devotes it to the hole in the windshield. And at the very end, he basically concludes that a bullet did come through there, but it didn't strike Kennedy. Kennedy most probably was struck in the throat by a shard of glass. Now, Rick and I disagree with that. We both believe the shot came early that struck Kennedy in the throat from the front, and it came from the North Knoll from behind the fence. And Rick believes it came from the badge man position. I believe it might have come from what I would call the SM Holland position, which is a position about 15 to 20 feet up from the corner. And there were footprints in the mud there. There was a bunch of cigarette butts that were left. Somebody was basically standing there for a period of time. And that's the point where SM Holland says, as he's standing on the overpass, he sees some smoke emanate from there as the shooting progresses. So we can split hairs on that, but the bottom line, Rick and I both strongly believe. And if you look at Willis 5, the photo from behind Kennedy that Phil Willis took, it's very close at that moment. It's about Z202. It's about the point where Kennedy was struck in the throat. There's a clear a shooter from behind the fence in the North Knoll had an unimpeded, clear view, piece of cake to make that shot. So that's my opinion of the throat shot, that he was struck from the right front from a shooter behind the fence.
So Brooks, what is our latest knowledge for the tag shot?
For the what?
For the wound to tag.
Well, there was supposedly down in that vicinity, there's a manhole cover, and you can see a photo of what Buddy Walters is down there. I forget all who's in that area, and apparently there's a FBI guy, and there's a a bullet embedded in the grass that supposedly was retrieved from that spot. Nearby, there is a notch in the curb, which the FBI came and cut out and did an analysis on. But there's some conjecture that a shot hit that curb and deflected, and Tag is hit by a ricochet, most likely a piece of the curb, a piece of concrete, as opposed to a bullet, but it might have been a bullet fragment. The
Okay.
challenge is, what is the angle from which that shot emanates, you know? That's the question.
Okay. And then my last question is the back wound. Thanks, Neil, for reminding me about that. What's our latest knowledge on that?
Well, I'm going out on a limb, and I think I covered it briefly in Bethesda 101. We'll pick up on when we do 102. I think the wound that Humes examined briefly when he stuck his finger and it went down to the first knuckle, he puts in the autopsy report that wound in the back had a downward trajectory, downward angle of 45 to 60 degrees, which is absurd. I think that wound was one of the wounds that were, I think it's an artifact that was something created during the pre-exam to substantiate a shot from high and behind Kennedy. So I think that was one of the alterations that they did. I do think the bullet that entered the neck and in the front, I think it struck the vertebrae, it fractured. And I seriously question whether or not Kennedy was shot from behind through his suit coat. And that was one of the points I made, as we close Bethesda 101. Because the Secret Service gathered up his clothes. Greer was the guy that took all the clothes in a bag and left the examining room in Parkland. And they absconded with these clothes. And they reappear at some point down the road. And I just made the point, if you like to speculate, maybe there's no hole in the back of the jacket or the shirt at that moment. Perhaps the Secret Service put those on a dummy or mannequin and then created that hole in the shirt and jacket after the fact. Because I'm of the opinion that potentially the bullet that struck the throat then hit the vertebrae. Kennedy was a swimmer and he had a lot of musculature in the neck and the shoulders and whatnot. It's very possible once that bullet hit the neck and fragmented and tumbled, maybe it actually never fully exited. A small fragment might have found its way towards the back of the skin. I'm not so sure that bullet actually ever exited. And if you like to speculate, I think somebody who was part of the cover-up actually made the hole in the jacket and the shirt after the fact. That's my opinion.
Well, that's not an unreasonable opinion, given the fact that they removed the body, which was evidence, and they removed the limousine, which was evidence. So why not tamper with the clothing?
They very well should have brought the clothing to the morgue, and they could have examined it. It's a missing piece of the puzzle that we'll never have.
Yeah. Just on the topographical survey that you mentioned, Brooks, there's some models going on at the moment. You obviously know Larry Rivera's blender because you
right
on the Project JFK calls the last couple of years. There was a guy at Kappa called Irving Nestor who did a presentation. I attended that remotely this year. I don't know if you've come across him, but he's done some work on Dealey Plaza, and he made a demonstration. And also, I think
I heard it was pretty good, right?
Yes, on the face of it, yeah, it was pretty good. It's not available, free. I think the entry level is $60 to get it. And also, there's a guy called John Daw, who you've probably heard of as well. I think he did some work. I think he worked with Dave O'Brien, when he spoke to us a few years ago, mentioned this. And I can't remember the name of the group that created this model, Dallas something. Have you heard about that one at all?
No, in fact, unfortunately I missed that presentation. I was in and out for some of what took place in this past weekend, but
did you do Kappa? Did you do Kappa or did you do the others?
No, I did the other.
Okay.
what I've done in my analysis is you can go and it's quite reliable. You can go to Google Maps and kind of do the satellite view, and then you can measure quite accurately the distance anywhere in Dealey Plaza, looking down vertically, point A to point B. So you have that data, and then the topographical map. That was a survey that was commissioned. So we know the elevations. You know, we know that we can determine the degree of slope on Elm Street. There's a lot of stuff that you can piece together. It's been very helpful in doing some analysis. In fact, I've used it. I haven't done this presentation yet, but I've used it to kind of put forward a theory where the stuck microphone was. It wasn't an RC. It wasn't on McLean's motorcycle. It was elsewhere in another vehicle. And I've used that analysis, that topo analysis survey of the plaza to try to piece together where I think the stuck microphone was.
I think Pat Spear debunked the McLean microphone position on his website. I might be wrong. It could have been another researcher, but I think he argued that he'd have to be traveling 180 miles an hour to get into the
to get to that position, right? Which he
position.
never really did. You can see in the Elsie Dorman photo video that she did. It's very blurry and sketchy, but you actually can see the McLean never really changes his position. But I'll just cut to the chase to the very end. My analysis, the stuck microphone is in Earl Cobble's car, the mayor of Dallas.
Okay.
So whether he did it or one of the two officers, I think there was a state trooper, I forget who was driving the car, but so either someone up front clicked it and did it, or Earl had the radio in the back and he did it. But my analysis that stuck microphone is in Cobble's car.
So do you buy into the acoustic evidence then as four shots?
You mean the HSCA version?
Yeah. Notwithstanding you dispute McLean's position, but do you
well, there's a great amount of debate on that, and
but do you actually buy into the that you do you feel that you can clearly hear four shots?
I haven't really focused on that so much. I found it fascinating that they disagree and they couldn't coalesce on the point at which the shots actually occurred. There's two versions of that story. You know, the HSCA says they either happen here, here, and here, or they happen. So they couldn't even formally agree on the sequence of the shots in terms of which frame of the Z film we're talking about. But I haven't. My work really was more. My analysis has been really try to figure out, okay, where was the stuck microphone?
Right.
And I will do a presentation on that at some point.
Hasn't Tink Thompson in his I haven't got his last book, but didn't he basically support again the acoustic evidence? Have you read that?
I haven't read it. No,
I haven't. Okay.
Neil, could I jump in again just very quickly?
That'll be your fourth question, Scott.
It's an extra time question.
Well, are we going to go to penalties?
Yeah, I think my team is an extra time at the moment, but I'm fascinated by, you know, Tony's conclusions around there being perhaps 3 headshots, because the consensus, well, not the consensus, but the official position was that Kennedy was shot in the head only one, and now we're looking at 3 headshots. But I was also interested in what the throat shot, if I can just ask about that, because Brooks had mentioned about where he potentially thinks that shooter would have been. What do we think about the windshield? Because there are witnesses who say that there was a shot through a through and through hole, front to back, through the windshield, and I think a lot of thought and opinion is about that was the throat shot. I mean, what does Brooks or anybody else on the call think about where the windshield damage originated? Was it bullet fragments, or was it a through and through bullet shot, which could account for the throat shot? Anybody?
I talked about this. This is a real point of contention among some researchers, but I came across a bit of research that was done by a student at UCLA of all places, which is where Lifton was. He was a master sergeant in the Air Force, and he did a study for his thesis to get his master's on how a bullet behaves when it's shot through glass. His last name was Lambert, and the reason he did this study is if there's a hostage situation and a sniper can shoot through a window to take out the perpetrator, how does even though you think you've got a clear shot through the window, how does the bullet behave when it goes through the glass? So it's a fascinating study. I've got the full thesis that he did. The bottom line is when bullets go through glass, they tumble and they deform. The head always deforms. It mushrooms to a certain extent. And then the bullet will, depending upon the angle of incidence and whatnot, and he used different ammunition. He varied the angle of incidence. I think he even used several different guns. So the bullet speed varied somewhat, but in every instance, the bullet wasn't a straight through and through. It changed direction, it tumbled, and it deformed. So to me, in my mind, that totally wipes out the possibility that a bullet through the windshield would have produced this small little round neat hole that Malcolm Perry talked about. And to their credit, there are bullets and bullet fragments found in the limo, which Mantic and enumerates in his new book, and he backs off from any speculation that a bullet went in the throat. He says it's now a shard of glass. That's his viewpoint, but I will say adamantly, there was no bullet that, even though the hole is from the front to back, in other words, the bullet's coming at the limousine from in front through the windshield, that bullet did not create the hole in Kennedy's neck. Absolutely not.
But it is another shot then, you think?
Well, I mean, for the life of me, you would assume that these shooters were pros and experienced shooters. Unless somebody got trigger happy and just jumped the gun, no pun intended, I don't know why you would fire through the windshield thinking that you were going to hit your target. Maybe just somebody, again, it's very possible you're hyped up, you're ready to go. Somebody just took a shot through the windshield, but it would not have made a pristine, neat little hole in Kennedy's throat, at least not the bullet.
Mm-hmm. I mean, my understanding, and I could be wrong, is that if you are a professional assassin, trained assassin, you're only going to have one shot. You're not going to reload and try again.
Well, keep in mind that these guys were positioned all around in Dealey Plaza, and I think there was a sequence. You don't fire until the limousine gets to point A. You don't fire until it gets to point B. Clearly, when it got down near Z313, the kill zone, there's a debate over whether or not the limousine actually came to a stop or slowed or whatnot, but it was going such a slow rate of speed. That was a point at which I think several gunmen fired all basically at the same time. Boom, boom, boom. Was it 3? Was it 4? But that was the kill zone where all those headshots occurred. So it's hard to explain the throat wound, which took place much earlier, why somebody would be shooting from such a far distance from in front of the limousine to boot and through the windshield. It's ludicrous. That's not a planned shot. It was an accidental shot. The great debate, of course, was that from behind or from in front? And I think the consensus is, and Mantic makes it well in this, that's what he devotes the whole chapter to, is that shot came from the front through the windshield. But again, not to be redundant, I would say no trained assassin worth his salt would trying to shoot Kennedy through the windshield. That's just, I mean, you have so many gunmen scattered about. and they all have orders. They all know the timing, the sequence, who's supposed to shoot and who's not, and so on. That it's a puzzling. That shot through the windshield is just a piece of this story that we'll probably never solve.
Yeah, thanks, Brooks.
Yeah. Nancy, you have another question?
Yes, thank you. Is there any trajectory on any of the wounds that align with the Umbrella Man? Hello.
Oh, sorry, was that to everybody?
Yeah, that was to anyone.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were asking Brooks that question.
Well, probably more pointed toward him.
Well, at that point, what's interesting at that point is Kennedy is turned and looking towards all those spectators on the right. You know, in Willis 5, when you see him, he's literally turned looking to his right. And so it opens up a lot of speculation. Not only the Umbrella Man, but there's another individual standing in that vicinity with his hand in a kind of an odd place. You know, could he be holding some sort of a small weapon? There's, again, that leads to just a whole bunch of speculation. But I think that throat shot, I kind of like the idea, whoever the Umbrella Man was. Of course, there's an individual came forward to the HSCA,
Right.
and there's debate over whether or not he actually was truly Umbrella Man. But I think that it's odd that on a beautiful sunny day like that, you've got somebody with an umbrella, much less he's pumping it up and down. I think I kind of like the storyline that he's reminding Kennedy of Neville Chamberlain, and that his father, as the ambassador to England, was an apologist for the Nazis, and there's all sorts of turns and twists with this story. But again, with so many gunmen surrounding Kennedy, shoot with the ability to fire at the right moment with a clear shot to hit him, I doubt if anybody right along the sidewalk there was going to be taking a shot at him. But you never know.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your thoughts.
Brooks, do you want me to pull up Willis 5?
Sure.
Right, I've got.
And I'll tell you what Rick and I do agree upon with Willis 5.
I found it. Now I've got it. Now the art of this, of course, is to try and share my screen. So bear with me. I'm gonna share that. Looks like come up yet?
Yes.
We can see it now, Neil.
Is this the one you're referring to?
Mm-hmm.
This is Willis 5.
Mhm.
And what I mean, Kennedy's looking diagonally to his right at this point.
Yeah, directly to his right. What's interesting about that is the shot that went into the throat nicked the right side, the anatomical right side of the trachea, the windpipe. The bullet did make a small puncture through the trachea. But when you turn Kennedy's head so far to the right, the neck actually twists, which I think supports. If you look all the way back to where the fence is there and behind Zapruder, a shot that hits Kennedy apparently near the midline of the throat, but then clips the right side of the trachea and then ends up in the back right, causing a bruise along the top of the right lung and the other things that were noted. Because his head is tilted so far to the right and his neck is twisted, I think that all lines up and supports a shot from. Now, Rick will say, you see the top of the arrow that you have there?
Yeah.
Rick will say that the shooter was kind of above that arrow, somewhere back in that area where Badgeman, in other words, Badgeman is along that fence, but he's back he's back away from the street. He's
Yeah.
on that leg of the fence. Whereas if you go back over more to the section of the fence that runs parallel with Elm, going back towards the railroad tracks, yeah, up in that area, to the yeah, right there, yeah, that would see. You have Black Dog Man there. Rick and I both believe Black Dog Man is painted in to hide Gordon Arnold.
Oh, that's an interesting notion.
Yeah, that's we both agree on that.
Okay.
And of course, as you know, when the shot was fired, Gordon went right past Gordon Arnold, literally whoosh, right past, and he hit the deck.
Yeah.
You know, he dropped to the ground after that first shot was fired. So that again, that all from our vantage point, Rick and I, we all think that ties to the first shot that hit Kennedy in the throat.
Why is Rick claiming that Badge Man is still credible? I thought that really was debunked based on, the size, and debunked 20 plus years ago. That the guy would have to be, I don't know, 50 feet back behind the stockade fence on a step ladder for the dimensions of the head to be equivalent to the dimensions of the head, in the Mormon photographs. Well, so you must be debating this quite forcefully, I would have thought.
Well, I'm going to reveal myself a little bit, but
Please don't, because I'm going to upload this at some point.
okay. But my personal bias is when you look at where the limousine is at 313, when it gets well down and it's in front of Zapruder, it would be very difficult for any shot to strike Kennedy in the head and not blow out on the left side of his head.
Yeah.
In other words, you're not shooting so much from in front. The angle doesn't allow. Now, Horn came to the conclusion, to his credit, and this aligns with what Hume said, it was a tangential wound. Horn basically believes that the shot that hit Kennedy near the right ear, the temple entry that Tony talked about today, Jenkins saw a lead smear, I think, as so did Fink, in the vicinity of the right ear, just above it in the temple area. Horn thinks that's a tangential shot that maybe came from the right front and basically just sliced off the back of the head, entered right near the right ear, exited in the back right, and he calls it a tangential shot. So when he was formulating his 1-2-3 shot scenario, he and Mantic a couple of years ago were disagreed on the 1-2-3. They had 3 shots, but they disagreed on a little bit on well, they didn't coalesce around one version. But Mantic had it actually coming in and slicing off and creating basically just like a little saucer plate for a teacup, just basically popping off that chunk right off the back of the head, which probably fell right down into the seat. But anyway, yeah, we can speculate a lot in terms of Badge Man, but the angle doesn't work. That was always the problem that I had. You're shooting too much from the side, and it'd be virtually impossible, except for Horn's contention that it might have been a tangential shot. Anything but that would have created damage. Now, just along those lines, one other interesting comment in the Belmont memo. Was there truly a bullet that was in the skull that they were in the process of retrieving at Bethesda, or was that just a cover to basically, because there's a bullet that's produced at the morgue, and we'll get into this more again in Bethesda 102, but there's supposedly a bullet that's found in the morgue handled by a lot of different people. David Osborne, the head of surgery at Bethesda, for one. Several people saw and handled this bullet. Does that tie to the Belmont memo? I think it does. Now, was there really truly a bullet in the skull? And if so, where was it? So just you can have a lot of fun and games with this, but I'm looking forward to actually picking up the pieces. Thank you, Tony, for doing this today. It's always lots of fun to continue to stir the pot on this.
Okay.
Certainly is.
In this Willis slide, Brooks, is the man visible that you mentioned when we were talking about Tom that had his hand in an unusual position?
Yeah, I think he's right next to Umbrella Man. See him there? He's got a hat on. He's
A hat
short and
on.
staff.
He's very short, isn't he?
Guy
Yeah.
here, this
He's
guy
got
here.
his hand up, kind of in an odd position.
Okay. Thank you.
No, Neil, I'm going to have to go now.
Yeah, no worries, Tony. I mean, I think it's a natural conclusion. So Brooks, Bethesda 102. I'm trying to line up the first quarter of next year. Are you and Rick in a position to do January or February, or would you prefer to be later in the year?
Well, we'll have to see. I think it might be more in the spring, like maybe April, May, but let me talk to him
Yeah,
and see
he
what we
did
can put
talk. He
together.
did a talk at Dallas this year, didn't he? Remotely.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of behind the scenes, it created a lot of talk about stirring the pot.
Okay, fair enough. What was the other question I had? Damn it, I've forgotten now. Okay, no worries. It was something to do with future talks, but I've forgotten. Okay, all right. Is there anything else before Tony goes? Otherwise, I will close it. No. Okay. Well, absolutely excellent, Tony, and dare I say it, it was an improvement on Canterbury.
Thank you.
Canterbury was good. So yeah, I mean, I thought there was certainly extra slides, and you put some more information on some of those slides. What I would like to do, if that's possible, is if you can send me the presentation, I'll upload that with the YouTube video at some point. I've got a bit of a backlog going at the moment for obvious reasons, but I will try and get this done as soon as possible. And if so, can we use the presentation, or do you see that as proprietary?
No, you can use the presentation, no problem.
Okay, that's brilliant. Okay, all right. Well, let's call it a day. Thank you very much indeed, and Brooks, thank you for your contribution. You as well, Nancy, and Scott as well. Great stuff.
Thanks to
I did
all.
want to
And
say,
thank you to the medical experts for speaking English.
Yes.
It really helps me. I've told Neil that the many conversations I had with David Lifton, because I kind of met him in the 80s and we had many conversations. I was constantly having to say, David, stop, speak English, okay? Not everyone has read on every medical aspect like you have. So this was just most